Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to another special guest episode. Today, I am so excited to welcome Dr. Amy Vertrees. She is a general surgeon with her own private practice general surgery with a special focus on breast cancer, in addition to general surgery. In addition to that, she is also the founder and CEO of the Business of Surgery series, including a successful podcast and a new book, Become the Boss MD, Success Beyond Residency. Amy, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to talk to you today.
Thanks, Megan. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So tell my listeners, for anybody who's not familiar with your work, just a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So I was in residency at Walter Reed. I was in the Army. So I went to the only military medical school in the US. And if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. It's Uniformed Services University, the Health Sciences. And, we become officers in military. So it's tri-service. We have Army, Navy, Air Force, and I was in the Army. And I finished medical school and went to residency at Walter Reed. I was there for the heights of the war. And so, certainly got a different training than we were anticipating. Then when I finished residency, I ended up deploying to Afghanistan twice and Iraq once as an Army surgeon, which was, phenomenal experience, and definitely had a training and experience that I would not have imagined. The military offers its own unique challenges for sure. So I served 7 years after residency as part of the payback. And after that, I decided not to stay in the military because our op tempo was really high. So I was deploying every other year. And with kids, it's a little bit much. It was a bit of a challenge. So I ended up leaving the military and going into employed practice because everyone said, you have to go to an employed job. That's just how it goes. And I did that for 3 years. But when my contract negotiations, came up, there was a lot of things that I wasn't really happy with. And it felt sort of like a, kind of this, is this all there is kind of thing? And this was 2020, which we all know was a little bit of a change for everybody. And I decided then to open my own practice. So I went with a practice management company. So it's private practice, but we banded together with a bunch of private practices under this company that helped us really negotiate strong contracts and things like that. And they helped us out a lot with some of the processes, but I'm able to buy my own building and have my own staff that I hire and bring in, and can really start to have the practice that I wanted, with a lot of control over how the processes are run and things like that. And so that's how that started. The Boss Business of Surgery series actually started when I was in the DC area at Walter Reed, and as a way to try to get people to come to our meetings for the American College of Surgeons. I was the chair of our Young Surgeons Committee. And at that time, I really needed to learn a lot of these things. So the premise behind the Boss is the lessons not taught in residency, things about contract negotiations, advocating for yourself, running a clinic, getting along with other people, difficult partners and colleagues, dealing with complications, and career changes, things that in residency we're taught how to become good physicians, but we're not really taught how to become good business people or getting along with other people, or a lot of the things that
just leadership in general, right?
Exactly. So many different factors, and there's just not time in residency. That there's a different focus. So recognizing, as many physicians, we're lifelong learners anyway, is providing a framework that helps people learn these things. So it started off initially as in-person meetings, but then over time in 2020, I picked it back up and decided to start a podcast. I have a coaching program. And over the last 3 years, and over the last year, actually, I started writing this book, but from lessons of being a coach for the last 3 years and all my lessons since finishing residency 2010, putting it together in a book that offers at least a framework of where to start with on some of these lessons that were not taught in residency to help people become more successful in residency, recognizing some of the challenges that we have.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to take us back a little bit because you and I were chatting before we started recording a little bit about your experience, in the employed position. And I think you alluded to this feeling of this is just kind of how it is. There's, I think you used the words desert wasteland. Like it was just kind of like this is just what life is going to be after having come out of, the intensity of school and training, and then you added this little stint in the military and all the excitement that comes along with that, right? And then moving into this employed position. And I don't think that we talk enough about how sometimes the middle parts, after we've sort of gotten our feet wet, can be a little boring. So I'd love to hear kind of what that felt like for you, and how you sort of worked through that feeling of like, this is just how it is and I'm kind of stuck here.
Yeah, I mean, that was the most interesting aspect of it. Was my job is fine. I mean, it's like lowercase fine,
Fine.
fine. Everything's fine. It's good.
Yeah.
And, by that time I was, gosh, I finished in residency 2010. So like a little over 10 years after residency. And I just remember thinking, like, is this all there is? I mean, I'm in this clinic and we had just moved down to a different floor. So instead of all these nice windows, we had this like brown everywhere, like brown carpet, and like the clinic staff itself, they're like, yeah, we'll help you, I guess. And I just remember thinking that all the things that were bothering me, the things that were, complaining about, I would be complaining about for the next 15 years. I saw nothing changing. And so I started realizing that having a good job just wasn't good enough anymore. That I had like this desire, I mean, achieved all these things and, was able to accomplish a lot. And then you get to the point where you arrive at this place and you're like, this is great. I've achieved it. And I can appreciate it for about 10 minutes.
Right.
And
I've made it.
But then you start to realize that we're not as effective as we could be. And a lot of these smaller lessons I've learned over time about how to be more effective in, getting what you want and advocating for yourself and delegating. But at the time, it just felt like it was never going to change. And it was that feeling of, I feel good, but it's never going to change. And I was like, is this what I really want to do? Just sit here for the next, 15 years and do that? And that's really what I think caused the change for me.
Yeah, that's, an interesting point that you make about how we might have learned along the ways, right? Kind of efficiency, effectiveness tools for ourselves. And, sometimes, that might be very focused on the work that we do, right? But sometimes it's, we've learned better systems. We've learned, it would be better for our practice if we did things this way. But we often have such little control over that. And so we can learn all of these things, right? And be able to see how things might be better and feel very ineffective at being able to get a system to change, right? Even if it's, a little system like, just our clinic look, our clinic environment. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I think that's an important thing that, again, we don't talk about enough is, so many of us are looking at the environments that we're in and seeing all the places that could change. And for some of us, we get very cranky and negative and judgmental about it, right? And share that feedback in ways that our management doesn't appreciate. But for you, that's not the route that you were taking, but just kind of appreciating, yeah, I don't need to stay here. Like, I don't need to just think that this is my only option. I don't know if you have any other, sort of thoughts about what that was like and sort of the decision process for you.
Oh, decision process has always been fascinating to me because, I quit suddenly on a day that I was not really anticipating quitting that day. But, quite honestly, it had to have been brewing for quite a long time because you don't just suddenly say, I quit and I'm going to just, stop all this and buy a building and renovate it and, open my own practice.
Right.
And like no normal person does that.
Especially if you're a proceduralist, right? Yeah.
It was interesting. I guess, I think the hardest decision we could make is leave a good situation, knowing there may be something better. And I think that I was having this suspicion that there was something better out there. And I'd been part of the Facebook group of Physician Private Practice. and, was fascinated with business aspects in general and things like that. And I had done a lot of those processes as part of the research in the past of the Boss series of how to do this before, which was, again, just informal meetings.
Mhm.
And in that moment when I would not have done it, I think, unless I was directly challenged, where they said, I was trying to make changes in the clinic and I was frustrated it wasn't happening. And our CEO at the time said, well, I don't think this is going to change, or something along the lines of that. And I was like, well, I don't think I can do this anymore. And he's like, does that mean you're quitting? I was like, yes,
Yes.
that day. And, it was funny because it was like this complete sense of freedom,
Mm.
like when we have that internal drive and we know what we really want, because a lot of times I'm confident that we know what we want, but we tell ourselves we don't, or we tell ourselves it's not possible.
Or we
And in
shouldn't
that
want that.
moment, I 100% know that you believe that too. And it's because we think that we're supposed to do something in life.
Mhm.
And so we do it, not knowing that our internal compass that's in there has plenty of other ideas and is simply waiting for us to realize that, just waits for an opportunity. And
Yeah.
that's what that felt like for me, is that I was already started getting coaching at that point, and had not quite become a coach yet, and realized, gosh, I was just holding myself back for no good reason. Like, no
Mhm.
one really cared whether I stayed or go. I mean, they do sort of, but it's really all about what I feel is true and unique to myself. And I could allow myself to do that. And luckily I had supportive husband, and the supportive administration, because they said as long as you like bring cases, we're fine. And so they
Mhm.
did get in the way. There wasn't a non-compete because I was still bringing my business to the hospital.
Mhm.
And so I was just really fortunate that I was able to tune into what I really wanted. And in that moment, I was able to speak up in ways that I could much more easily do now. But back then, still under that, I have to follow the rules and I have to do all the things and I have to get permission. And in that moment, I didn't seek anyone's permission but my own.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that was like, whoa,
Whoa.
wow. And now it's so much easier now, but it felt really hard then,
Yeah.
until I said it out loud. And then I realized nobody died and everything's fine and I could figure it out. That really tapped into this ability for me to say, I can tune into what I think and what I want and make it happen.
Yeah.
And that I could be much more effective than I was. And I think that's what changed for me.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like, coming to an appreciation of really that self-trust, like I've got my own back here and I
Mhm.
can make my own decision,
Yeah.
even if you don't know exactly what that's going to look like, right? It's such an important step for so many of us. And yet not everybody will kind of make that jump or sort of realize that that's what they need, right? Especially to jump without a plan, right? Like you might, like, there may have been like well, I could do my own thing. I know about private practice, like I know I can do that. Um, but so often we're stuck in this place of like, I need a safe job. I need some security before I leave this thing, especially when it's fine.
Lowercase fine.
Lowercase fine. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I'm curious too for you, because I think we also can get stuck in having, had an idea in the beginning of our career of what our career would look like. Okay, well, I'm going to get a job, at such and such place in this system, and the way it's going to look, might be like, careers I've seen before me, and that's what I want. And then we may find ourselves, kind of a number of years in. I also graduated residency in 2010. So we're both of an age in our careers. We might find ourselves in this place of, now I think I want something different. I think I want a different flavor of things, but we may still feel really tied to that idea of how we thought things were going to be. Did you run into any of that challenge, and sort of deciding that you wanted a change in that way?
Oh, I can tell you that not only did I feel that way, that it's pretty common. Uh,
Hmm.
and I call it the mid-career slump, but there's people that have much more elegant words for it. I discovered Arthur Brooks' From Strength to Strength, where he talks about going from, this linear path of achievement and jumping to the second curve where you go more from achievement to more purpose-driven life and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that shift is something that we all do. I mean, it's a fact that we're not always going to be wanting to work necessarily at the level that we did. We're not going to be continuing this linear pathway or hustling as we've done, from residency to our early career. And this natural career progression is something that I think that we haven't heard a lot about because there's some element of shame to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what do you mean you worked this hard and now you want to stop? Or you want to change directions?
Right.
Or, what was good before isn't good anymore.
Right.
And, or just our different desire to do it. So there's a lot to that transition that involves a level of shame and self-trust and like a lot of factors that we're just never really taught, that no one really talks about because of that. I think it's a little bit more prevalent now if you pay attention to it, because of Brené Brown's work as well,
Mm-hmm.
that I've paid attention to, that it happens to a lot of us in a career where it's just not good enough anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gotten me to an appreciation of the fact that, I've now been in my job at the same hospital now, private practice for 3 years, but the same hospital for a little over 6.
Mm-hmm.
And the job is not really the same as I started, even though it seems like I've been in the same job.
Right.
The job changes every year and I change every year. It just seems like we've been traveling together, but I see at some point I'm going to continue to change in a direction and the job will change in a direction to where we diverge.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm now no longer think that that's anything worth worrying about. And it's not worth stressing about. Is simply for me to say, like, who am I this year? What is the job this year? And are we still on the same path? And I think it's as simple as that now, rather than worrying like, should I, shouldn't I, am I good enough or not good enough? And it's just that self-assessment and the job assessment and saying, are we still matching?
Yeah.
That's my thought of the career slump is actually a career divergent and completely normal.
Yeah. No, I love that imagery too of, highlighting the job changes and I change. And at some point, especially if they're, sort of curving away from each other, as they frequently are, it's not always. As that happens, there becomes a tipping point at some time where it's like, okay, well, now it's far enough apart that this just isn't a good match anymore. And some careers will change the opposite direction, right? They'll okay, well, the job is sort of becoming this, or they're creating this role for me, and that matches up with my, my desire to teach more, or, like whatever that looks like. But recognizing that that is not always the case, and it's totally normal that we change at this time in our life, right? I'm 42 now, right? What I want at 42 is different from what I wanted at 32, and I am a different person.
Mm-hmm.
And that's normal. That's okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's so the paths can diverge. It doesn't mean they have to separate either.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last, couple of years, especially private practice is hard. It's a different mind.
A different animal.
Like different challenges that come up, and it's been everything that I wanted and maybe a little more. So there's a lot of lessons and all that too, and it's exactly the challenge that I needed.
Yeah.
But it made the job a little challenging, so I could feel myself pulling away, as a lot of us with all the challenges, not just the private practice, but the job altogether, being a surgeon in the environment, post-COVID, staff shortages, decreased reimbursement, I think a lot of us are stopping going, why are we doing this again? And giving myself a little permission to say, I don't have to stay if I don't want. I mean, I literally could leave,
Right.
Was enough to overcome a lot of the barriers of saying, I'm not stuck. I actually really could leave, and I think the more time that I spend thinking about leaving makes me more likely to stay, because now it's a choice that I'm staying.
Mm-hmm.
So the job and myself diverge, but then come back together some with better awareness of what I'm doing. And so I found myself every now and then having just much more appreciation than I did before, because when I think about leaving, then it reminds myself why I did it in the first place. So I had an episode, the Boss podcast early on, I think it's like the third one, where I talked about why we became surgeons. This was a post that I put it in a surgeons group, two surgeons group actually. And I asked people like, why did you become a surgeon? And that was like so inspiring to remember why
Mm,
you did it in the first place.
mhm,
And, so when people talk to me about, burnout, I usually direct them to that, a couple key points that I direct people to when they're feeling most burnout. One is to remind yourself why you did it in the first place,
mhm.
because that's so easy to forget. The other thing is to give yourself permission to quit if you want.
Yeah,
And then all of a sudden it becomes a choice to stay and with a much different mindset.
yeah.
And the third is that we must stop the treadmill more often than we do. And I wrote a Kevin MD article, and there's also a podcast episode called Physicians Need Growth Days. And
Mm,
this it was I think 2021 maybe when I wrote the article. And I just picked 2 random days a month that I said, I'm not going to do anything. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to do this.
yeah, yeah,
And I picked 2 random days, but I didn't trust myself to like not fill them with stuff. So I put them randomly in the schedule, and it's like, I'll see you tomorrow. They're like, no, you're not here. I'm like, oh, that's right. But it's what happens is that we're supposed to be making these decisions when we're already overwhelmed. The
yeah,
very first thing you have to do is to stop being overwhelmed. And the only way to stop being overwhelmed is to stop the treadmill.
right.
And it is so easy to do. Those two
Yeah,
days, nobody noticed.
yeah,
I was the only one that noticed because I was able to think and plan and make space. And over time, I added 4 days a month. And then I built it on Wednesdays. So Wednesdays are my administrative day, and I have to continually fight myself and others to not, violate that time.
yeah,
But it's important for us to recognize that that is something that is not a big career change that we can do right now. And it's
mhm,
absolutely critical for us to appreciate a lot of the non-clinical, non-monetary, seemingly time that we're not giving ourselves chance to, because we'll push it after hours, we'll do other things, we don't think it's worthwhile.
yeah,
There's a lot of reasons we tell ourselves not to take this time. But whenever I see people burning out, the very first thing is I'll drop that article or say, just stop the treadmill
yeah,
for a little bit.
yeah.
And that gives you perspective, because you know the right answer. Like, we all know what the right answer is. But the problem is we typically just don't give enough space to find out what that is.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And it's interesting that when we have CME days, right, or or CME requirements, right, so that we're staying, up to date in sort of the medical aspects of our professional development, and that's important. But what about those non-medical, personal professional development things, right? Other things that people want to do, because usually when I talk with physicians, there's something else, that really sort of calls to them, whether it's clinical or not clinical. But we don't give ourselves time and space. We just kind of tell ourselves in the back of our mind, like, oh, I should do that thing. I should do that thing. I should read that book. I should start that podcast. I should do whatever it is, but we do not make time for it. And sometimes we tell ourselves it should be easier than it is, or a number of other kind of lies that kind of keep us stuck. But I love that idea of, no, we need to stop the treadmill. We need to not feel guilty about stopping the treadmill. That's a totally normal, human, appropriate thing to do, to stop the treadmill and give ourselves the brain space. Yeah, and whether that's rest, right, or play, or pursuing something that you're interested in, right? Can you share some examples of what that time ends up looking like for you? Just maybe some different choices that you make.
Oh, that's such a great question, because the most important thing is, as a physician, we'll tell ourselves we're doing it wrong. There's a right way to do it.
Right, right.
Also, and I think the only way that you have to think about it is stop the treadmill, which just means I'm not adding anything. I don't have to add anything. I
Yeah.
could just take the day off and do nothing.
Mhm.
But for me, doing nothing would be stressful. So doing something. And at first it was just pausing just to not add anything to it. So those first days look like catching up with notes. So I would do a little bit of work. I'd go in, but it was free work, meaning that I didn't feel like it wasn't a burden. So I
Mhm.
started developing a different relationship for being at work, that I can go there and be in control of my time. And then I started doing a little bit more thoughtful aspect of it too, of saying, okay, I'm doing some of my notes in this time. How much are these notes taking? And so I realized that it would take me about 2 hours, to do notes. I was like, okay, I don't want to use this day for that. So, but it does take 2 hours and it has to be done. So then I started adding time into the regular day for that too, and
Mhm,
making
mhm,
changes based on that. But those times and spaces of, some people call it CEO time too,
mhm.
of like looking at the processes in clinic and saying, how do I become more efficient? How do I gain back my time? So then those 2 days became investments for figuring out how to get more time back. And
Yeah.
that's when I started realizing just how valuable they were, that it wasn't just the 2 days of pausing, it was the 2 days of pausing that allowed me to gain much more time back by questioning what was actually happening and start to change the processes. So, and then I would, give myself just to figure out how long things took. So if I wanted to do like, if I wanted to go for a walk, how long did that take? Well, I had to put on my shoes and I could go for a walk. And I was like, I'm going to need to set 45 minutes aside to do a 30-minute walk, things like that.
Mhm.
And I started being much more realistic about my time, because when you're overwhelmed and you want to do all the things, we either don't look because we know it's impossible, or two, we just flat out lie to ourselves.
Right. Yeah, no, 100%. Like we completely underestimate, which time something's going to take or how much we can get done in a certain amount of time. Right. But we're so fried. We're so ineffective at those times. No, I love that idea of, that time. It's kind of like the CEO of me time.
Mhm.
Right. And because some of that's going to be probably work related, but some of it could not be work related and just kind of life related. How do I plan things out so that I make time for that exercise, make time for spending with friends or family, and I figure out how to get that work done during work time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because I have another one coming up on Monday, which is, giving them a task, like to understand what you're going to do, I think
Mhm,
is helpful too. So like on Monday, I do not have clinic patients like I typically would, but
mhm.
I'm going into the office and made it very clear. I was like, if you need something, a process change you don't like, we're going to check in. And Monday I'm there to work on the clinic aspect too.
Mm,
Meeting
mhm.
with my office manager, meeting with my partner, meeting with my MA, and really just kind of a pause and assessment of things too. And the goal of that day is to make sure the next quarter goes well. Um,
Yeah.
so you really start, being in control of what you do. And for me, with a small private practice, it makes sense to do that because, I am the leader of that clinic. If you're in a bigger place, you can do that for yourself and you can do it on a smaller scale too. But really, if you're going to take the time, how are you going to get that time back in a multiplying factor? I think is the most helpful aspect, because my goal on Monday is to make sure I gain a week or more back, that kind of thing.
Right, right.
And so then you
That's so
start to
interesting.
realize how much control we have over our
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And the whole goal is to become a creator of your time and not a reactor of your time. And that was the big shift for me, is that I was always just putting out fires. I was always just responding to what was coming. And I can always tell when I need one. So now I can actually even tell when I'm feeling reactive, when I'm feeling just fires everywhere, is when I need to say, stop. We need to create some space and stop this. And being able to tune in to when you need that is very, very helpful in preventing burnout too, is
Mhm.
because you're not going to let yourself burn out. And I could tell, we've talked about this before, when I'm crispy around the edges,
Yeah.
I can definitely feel, like when you watch the toast and it's burning, like that's me. We need to
Right.
stop it now.
Otherwise, it's gonna be too burnt and we won't like it. But
Exactly.
yeah, I'm curious too. I feel like we could go on for a very long time, but I want to hear a little bit about sort of the mindset transition, excuse me, that you had to do. I think about, the challenges of training within medicine within the military, right? And the highly regimented nature of that, to then transitioning to an employed practice and, kind of the differences that are there, and then to your own practice, right? Where you are now the boss, you are now the one who is running all of the things, because that seems like just a really quite tremendous arc to me. And I'm sure that we have some lessons to learn from you and your journey with that.
Well, it is fascinating to work in lots of different environments, to realize just how much personal control we have.
Mhm.
A lot of times we blame the system, and I credit the military for helping me relieve the system of obligations, because the military is like this big immobile thing that to get changes happen, everyone sort of understands that it's virtually impossible,
Right.
So
You
that,
can't suggest a change and yeah, do
or you
anything
can
about
suggest all you want, just don't
it.
expect it. Well, in some ways, there's several good things about the military. They're very regimented, so when a protocol came in, like you were to mark the patient didn't go back unless you had that, they were very strict on the guidelines, and it
Mhm.
wasn't anyone's fault. So you didn't have to say that nurse is just being a jerk for this. You're like, well, we have to,
Mhm.
so when you have a big system like that, there's lots of onerous rules, because that's how you get a big group to stay in line. And I think a lot of people are seeing that as their jobs have become under more and more corporate management getting larger, they're seeing a lot more rules and regulations.
Mhm.
And that's very similar to what I see in the military. And you have to do that to keep a lot of people in line. So if you're going to be part of that system, that's the model that they work under. It's the only way to control a bunch of people. And it's annoying as hell for the individual person. But in some ways, I really appreciated a lot of their safety aspects and their empowerment aspects with leadership things. We were encouraged to take leadership things and take on projects and stuff like that. So I really appreciated the focus on the process and not it being
Mhm.
individual persons
And teams don't always work together, right? So if everyone knows that the rules are this, then regardless of who you're working with, right, it functions the same way, right?
and we were protecting the mission. So it
Mhm.
wasn't about individual people, it's the mission, which is, a good lesson, but it's also difficult with the individual people. So that process was fascinating to watch. When I went to employed physician, this is at a community hospital, 250 bed place. It was small enough that I could still get to know a lot of leaders in place, and I really got to know them and appreciate them, their thought process, and really understanding what goes into a lot of the decisions in the hospital. So unlike these big corporate things where you don't really understand where things are coming from, and I was at a smaller place where I could start to see some of the decision making in happening in person, start to recognizing these are all just people doing the best they can. And
Mhm.
without good communication, you won't know what they're thinking. So some of the rules, when I was in the meetings and understood what they were thinking, made perfect sense. But the person on the receiving end maybe wouldn't understand it as much. So recognizing that some of the direction of the leaders is to understand, to make sure that the message is communicated from people to people, because in the absence of knowing what's happening, we mind read and come up with lots of things that can hurt the process. So mind reading and isolation, I think, some of the biggest challenges. And we didn't have as many processes. So I was glad that I brought some of the regimented thing, focus on processes, into what could otherwise be a chaotic environment. So one aspect, we had a great breast center, very, excuse me, understood about what we're going to do. And so I brought that process here. So I think that we really did help with breast cancer treatment.
Mhm. Technical difficulties here.
And then private practice, oh my gosh. And then I was responsible for creating these processes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yep. There we go.
I'm getting over a cold.
That's good.
So yeah. So then I had to do all the things.
Okay. And we're back now.
Yes. And when I created the private practice, we had some systems in place, but luckily all the things I did before really helped me create systems in place that helped.
Yeah. 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 And carrying those skills with you of really an understanding of the need for those processes, right, at a different level, right, and how that actually helps groups come to work together as opposed to, just kind of leaving it to chance. I don't know. They used to do it this way, but not really understanding the importance of having a clear process for people to follow as part of well, this is, this is kind of the way that we perform together as a group and as a team, and, the expectations for this. Because those are really important skills that most of us don't really appreciate at that level. And if we transition from employed to, kind of our own practice, private practice, like whatever that looks like, we often are unprepared for the challenges of managing other people, creating successful teams, right, where we have good support because people understand, what we need from them. Can you speak a little bit about your experience, sort of becoming this private practice owner and, having to learn how to, create a good working environment for your staff? Because again, I think that's another area that we often don't get to hear very much about, especially when we're employed.
Yes, that's such the most important learning thing that I learned in private practice. I'm so fortunate to have a small team of people, and everyone warned me with private practice the biggest problem was going to be personnel.
Mm-hmm.
But I started off with this. I expected to have cutoffs. So it had me and two other people. I had an office manager and someone in the office. We were going to hire an MA or a nurse. And I thought that would be it. It's like just me. And then when I left, my partner was laid off. So he joined us.
Mm-hmm.
So then we added more staff. And then, so what started off really small was great because there's sort of this, like we're building something new and there's some excitement. And as the practice got bigger, then I started realizing that the practice was growing, the people were not growing with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so as the practice changed, like the job changed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I started realizing the job changed, but the people don't necessarily change. And that's exactly what happened. So there was a little bit of recognition that this thought that came to me that people are going to leave. And it's okay. It was that when we hold on to people that we shouldn't hold on to is the problem. We're not doing them any favors. They're not doing us any favors. And recognizing when someone has outgrown the job or the job has outgrown them is really helpful to help them understand. Because when you expect the job and the people to be the same, but it's not, it causes a lot of distress. Absolutely. So I had, some people that joined me in the practice that were really all in, and then, they turned toxic. And I was like, what? I mean, that was like so hard to deal with until I started realizing that what had happened, that they hadn't changed when the practice changed. That was on a big scale. So that was really traumatic. So when you start to realize that people will come and go, then you start not being necessarily attached to people, and not in like a pathologic way of just saying that it really is, they just have a job to fill. You can appreciate why they're there. When you understand what their job is, you have them focus on the job, creating, their standard operating procedures. So I'm really big on focusing on make sure I know what you're doing. And that was really helpful in a lot of ways. It shows appreciation that I'm really caring about what their job is. It gives them some directive to be very clear on what their job is, and they could take vacation and they could go because, we know that what
they're supposed to do.
It's really helpful. And then they can also give them permission to leave too. It's like, and then when you hire someone new, you're not starting from zero, you're starting from their experience. And then that person comes in and shapes the role somewhat. So it makes these transitions much less traumatizing than they could be. And especially all of us in dealing with these turnovers, really focusing on the processes and the job is going to make your life a lot easier. The other thing, this is a huge lesson that I've learned and still learn, is when someone really likes you, they want to please you. And when we ask them to do something, when we delegate something, first we overcome our inability to delegate. And then, congratulations, you can now delegate tasks. And then you're like, why isn't it working? Why aren't they turning stuff in? And so a couple mistakes that I made with delegation was I didn't give a time frame. I need this by Thursday, and you could pick whatever time frame you want and be flexible, but it's making sure you're on the same page with when it needs to be done. So one thing I would just sort of wait, why isn't it done? Like, well, I never actually told them when it was done. So, I mean, that's on me. And the second is I wouldn't hear from them about a task. I was assuming it was getting done. But what was happening a lot of times in some of these more complex things, I thought they knew what to do. I thought it was clear. I had snapshots and things like that. But my mental process may not be their mental process. And especially if they like you, they're not going to come and ask because they don't want you to think badly of them. They don't want to trouble you. And so not just have a deadline, but have a plan of saying, I'm going to check with you on Tuesday just to see how things are going.
Yeah.
Make sure to ask me for any questions. I don't expect you to necessarily know how to do all these things. So what you do is start setting up some expectations that it's okay to not know how to do something. Because a lot of people who want to, their own people pleasing, aspect
Yeah.
will do this for you. And then what'll happen is if you don't, what they see is like you just getting mad because it's not there. So they're sitting there overwhelmed, afraid to ask you, and now you're yelling at them.
Right. Right. Yeah. And people need that structure, right? They need, some standardized processes to follow. They need some expectations and accountability, and to know that you're safe to ask questions. I love that statement. I don't expect that you're going to know exactly what to do, all through this process, but this is what I want you to start with. I'm going to check back with you and making sure that we actually do check back with them. Right? How do we have a system for that so we remember to do that? And really letting them build a skill with your coaching in place. And then I imagine, sometimes that's not going to work, right? Sometimes that person is not suited for that job in whatever capacity, right? And without that expectation, accountability, coaching sort of process, we're never going to learn that they're just not a good fit for what's needed there. Right. And it may be that there's other tasks that they do instead, or, we ask somebody else to do that task, or maybe they're just not a good fit for your clinic environment. Right. And we never learn that unless we challenge people to sort of step into those roles.
And so many people are not in a job that's a good fit for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of these bigger places, it's hard to get rid of people.
Right.
And so it could be, a double bind there. Like they know they're underperforming, but they don't know what else to do, or they think that this is, all there is. And, we think beating them up more is going to help. Or ignoring them. Ignoring them is just as bad, honestly, because can you imagine going to work and no one really wants to talk to you or help you or challenge you? So I think that for us to be aware of what other people are thinking and how we can help them succeed in their job, by first overcoming our need for them to do something. I mean, they still need to do something. I'm not saying not, but for us to have a little bit of a greater appreciation for why they're underperforming. And that is when you start mastering how to help other people. Because helping other people doesn't mean telling them what to do. It's a lot of times, telling them what to do, but then asking, how would you do it? What is your thought process? And this is how I think it should be done. Are you understanding? And is there a better way to do it? To being really open. And it takes time. I mean, and if you're overwhelmed and slammed, it's not a good place to be. Hence, stop the treadmill first.
Right.
But
looping back that important concept. Yes.
Yeah. These are all like lessons that I learn over and over again. But I've definitely boiled them down to some, true basics for us to remind ourselves is to check in when we're getting crispy. Then second, to check in with other people, make sure they're not getting crispy. And, taking the time and understanding to move past that is really the best way to serve ourselves and the system too.
Yeah. And, for those of us who are, out listening, this is from the lens of private practice, but I think there's also a lot of applicability to our employed positions. Think about taking, PTO days for yourself that aren't connected to family vacations, for example, kind of building that in so that, you are well taken care of yourself and coming to work in a place that feels much more balanced. Being able to work with people who work closely with you to create systems that help you both be successful, right? That give you both, the appropriate level of challenge. I think, we can often feel that we don't have any control over our staff if we're employed. And yet a lot of staff want to work collaboratively with us, not all of them, but we do have those opportunities to sort of lead those small team dynamics sometimes. So that's really quite helpful. And tell us, so somebody is out there listening, and they're, perhaps in an employed position right now, and they kind of also have this little nagging feeling that maybe they want to leave and start their own thing, but they are in that place of, not trusting themselves, not really feeling like they can kind of make that jump. What do you want that person who is doing fine, lowercase f, what do you want them to know that you wish that maybe somebody had shared with you at that stage in your life?
I mean, such a great question. The first is to recognize that it's possible to leave. What really helped me in making that decision when I was wondering whether I was going to stay or go was what was holding me back. And the first thing was financial. I'm the primary breadwinner of our family. So when I started realizing the facts of it, I mean, like not the fear of it, but the facts of it, like I could do locums if I wanted.
Yep.
I could not work for a year and be okay. So when I looked at our finances, the idea of money scarcity went away. So when I started realizing, asking myself, what am I worried about? That's what really made the difference. And recognizing I could leave, I think that's the most powerful aspect that we have, because we'll say, I don't want to leave my house. I don't want to leave the schools my kids are in. My spouse is happy. My family's happy. When we tell ourselves we have to be at that job, that is what breeds a lot of resentment. When you realize there's like 100 different ways, and trust the process of when we follow what is true and genuine and unique to us, that's when we start making decisions that are right for us, not based on fear or have to, but on, of course I can do it. And this is the right path.
Yeah. 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 And I think that's such an important thing to consider, of just because things are fine, just because you're the primary breadwinner, you have to really sit down and look at, the elements that are there, and understanding that thankfully, we are high earners regardless of our specialty. And, there's almost always opportunities such as locums or something that we can do to keep some money coming in as we are thinking more deeply about what it is that we want, right? Whether that's, a different employed position, starting a private practice, joining a private, like a direct primary care, like whatever that looks like, leaving clinical medicine, we can do something along the way that brings enough in that we are not going to be homeless, which is a common fear that we have. It's like, I'm just always surprised by how many people go there. Like, oh, I don't want to be homeless. I'm the breadwinner. It's like, yeah, and we're probably not going to be homeless, right? Yes. We're not going to let ourselves get there.
And my favorite thing to tell people, to remind them, is to remind them of who they are. I mean, we forget that all the things that we've already done, like to be a college graduate and to be a physician and to be, someone who's finished residency and in practice, just how valuable that is. You've already achieved probably the top 1% of the population of the world. We could actually stop and have accomplished more than most people. So for us to stop for a bit if we need it, for us to stop and find a different job, for us to stop and, even do a different career, that we forget who we are, and all the things that we've sacrificed before have been investments in our ability to do anything that we want. And when we're surrounded by high achievers, we forget that we're high achievers, but we really have the ability to do almost anything that we want. It's our mental blocks that keep us trapped.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's easy.
In comparison to other high achievers around us, right? Exactly. Oh, I 100% agree with you on that one. So, tell us where my listeners can find out more about you, your book, the programs that you offer, because people are going to want to know.
You can find all that at bosssurgery.com. There'll be a link to the book, which is Become the Boss MD, Success Beyond Residency, where I talk about lessons not taught in residency. It follows the arc of a protagonist named Julie, of getting the first job, figuring out the practice, dealing with other people, dealing with the complications, dealing with time and effort and issues, and then career changes. So it follows the path of, what we would potentially be expected to do. It's going to hit people in different areas of their career. So some parts of the book will matter now and some later. The Boss podcast has a lot of interviews of people. It's primarily for surgeons, but I think this could be applicable for everyone. We talk about getting laid off and the stress management and burnout and financial aspects, lots of different things that are applicable to people. Like when the administration doesn't understand what you do,
Mhm.
what happens when you're under a bad leader. So there's a lot of really transferable themes in that. I also have a coaching program. My group is for women physicians. I have a one-on-one practice where I coach anyone, and those are all found on bosssurgery.com.
Great. And we'll have links to that in our show notes for today. Amy, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. I do feel like we could probably go on for hours, but
You probably could. I think I lost you though. Can you hear me?